November 25th, 1942. The world is not looking here. The planet's eyes are fixed on the south, on the shattered city of Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army is about to be caught in a pincer of Soviet steel. But hundreds of kilometers to the north, in the Zhukov salient, a storm of even greater magnitude is brewing. An offensive so colossal that its failure would be erased from history. For the soldier Ivanov, huddled in a frozen trench, grand strategy means nothing. His world is the biting wind, the swirling, blinding snow, and the tremor of the earth beneath his feet. He is one of nearly 2 million men that Marshal Georgy Zhukov has assembled to annihilate the German Ninth Army. The air vibrates with the roar of artillery, a 1-hour preparatory bombardment that is supposed to pulverize the enemy defenses. But the blizzard swallows the sound and the fury. Shells are lost in the fog, exploding aimlessly in a white, indifferent landscape. When the order to attack comes, Ivan rises with thousands of comrades, a human wave crashing against an invisible wall. Fire from perfectly camouflaged German machine guns tears through their ranks. Men fall into the snow, staining it a red that freezes almost instantly. The T-34 tanks advance blindly, their crews barely able to see beyond their own tracks. They sink into snow-hidden ditches, are shattered by mines, or worse, drive into perfectly calculated killing fields. This is not a battle. It is a slaughterhouse. From the first moment, the Soviet soldiers understand why this place, this cursed salient on the front line, has been given a whispered, terrible name, the Zhukov meat grinder. The man orchestrating this storm of fire and steel was the most legendary figure in the Soviet Union, Army General Georgy Zhukov. He was the savior of Leningrad, the defender of Moscow. A man whose iron will was as famous as his brutal indifference to casualties. For Zhukov, armies were not collections of individuals, but instruments of power, masses of force to be applied at the decisive point until the enemy broke. His plan for Operation Mars was of staggering ambition, even by his standards. A series of massive pincer attacks, launched from the north and south, were to sever the Zhukov salient, trapping and annihilating the entire German Ninth Army. In terms of men and tanks, the scale of Mars was comparable, if not superior, to Operation Uranus at Stalingrad. If successful, it would not only eliminate the perpetual threat Zhukov posed to Moscow, but could trigger the collapse of the entire army group center. Zhukov was convinced the German army was on the verge of collapse. He believed the Wehrmacht's morale was broken, its reserves depleted, and that one decisive, crushing blow in the central sector would shatter them. He fatally underestimated the resilience of the veteran troops facing him and, above all, the tactical genius of the man commanding them. Zhukov gambled everything on brute force, unaware he was heading straight into a death trap designed by Germany's foremost defensive expert. On the other side of the front line, in a makeshift command bunker, Colonel General Walter Model listened to the attack reports. Nicknamed Hitler's fireman, Model was everything Zhukov was not. He was not a grand strategist, but a master of defensive tactics, a genius of improvisation in the midst of crisis. He was energetic, relentless, and possessed an uncanny ability to always be in the right place at the right time, often restoring broken fronts with his pistol in hand. For months, Model had transformed the Zhukov salient into a fortress. He knew the Soviets would attack. German intelligence, through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations, had painted a clear picture of Zhukov's intentions, and Model had prepared. His defense was not a rigid line meant to be broken, but an elastic, lethal web designed to absorb the blow, channel the enemy, and destroy him. In the weeks before the attack, his intelligence teams had achieved something crucial. It was not a single manual captured in a daring raid, but something far more valuable, the culmination of months of study. They had analyzed captured T-34s, interrogated prisoner crews, and compiled all possible data. They knew its strengths, but more importantly, they knew its weaknesses. The poor visibility from inside, the two-man turret that forced the commander to also act as gunner, the vulnerable points in the side and rear armor. This knowledge was the cornerstone of Model's defense. He did not simply dig trenches. He created what became known as the pack front, fronts of anti-tank guns. He concentrated dozens of 75mm Pak-40 cannons and the fearsome 88mm anti-aircraft guns in key sectors, perfectly camouflaged and with overlapping fields of fire. They were kill zones, ambushes on an industrial scale, waiting for Zhukov's tank waves. Model's key decision, as the first reports of Soviet penetrations reached his headquarters, was not to panic. His doctrine of elastic defense allowed him to give ground tactically. He let some Soviet units advance, let them push deep into the salient, stretching their supply lines and exposing their flanks. He held his elite panzer divisions, the 1st, the 9th, and the Grossdeutschland, as a mobile reserve, concealed and ready to counterattack. He wasn't going to plug holes. He was going to sever the enemy spearheads at their root. The trap was set. The Soviet vanguards were rushing into a slaughterhouse they could not see. Euphoric at their apparent initial success, Model waited, watching the maps, biding his time for the precise moment to unleash his wolves. The largest tank battle the world had yet seen was about to begin, not as a head-on clash, but as a cold, calculated dissection. Before we witness Model spring his trap and turn Zhukov's greatest offensive into his most humiliating defeat, we invite you to join our community. If you are passionate about military history, narrated with the detail and depth these events deserve, subscribe and activate notifications. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten stories and presenting them as they have never been told before. The first days of the offensive were a confused butchery. Amidst the blizzard, waves of Soviet infantry smashed against the German lines. In some sectors, sheer numerical pressure managed to create breaches. On the southern flank, the Soviet 6th Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps achieved the deepest penetration, crossing the strategic highway between Rzhev and Sychevka and pushing into the German rear. For the T-34 crews, it was a moment of euphoria. They had broken the front. Victory seemed within reach. But as they advanced, a strange sense of unease began to creep over them. The supporting infantry had been left behind. Unable to keep pace with the tanks in the deep snow and under constant fire, communications were terrible. They were alone, an armored column advancing blindly into enemy territory. It was then that Model unleashed hell. From hidden positions in the woods and villages, the Pakfronts opened fire. It was a mass execution. The T-34s, advancing in tight columns along the few passable roads, were annihilated. 75 and 88mm shells tore through their armor as if it were cardboard, turning them into blazing torches. Tanks that tried to maneuver in the fields got stuck in the snow, becoming easy targets. The veteran writer Pyotr Mikhin, who fought there, would later recall, "We attacked Rzhev across fields of corpses. Many plains of death and forests of death appeared." The description was literally true. The fields before the German positions were littered with the smoking wrecks of hundreds of Soviet tanks and the frozen bodies of their crews. While the Soviet vanguards were being massacred in the kill zones, Model launched the second phase of his plan. His panzer divisions, which he had patiently held in reserve, sprang into action, not to reinforce the front line, but to strike the exposed flanks of the Soviet penetrations. Like steel scalpels, German tank wedges cut into the enemy columns at their base, severing their supply and communication lines. The 6th Tank Corps and other units that had advanced so successfully suddenly found themselves trapped. Euphoria turned to panic. They were surrounded, tens of kilometers behind German lines, without fuel, ammunition, or support. The battle transformed. It was no longer a Soviet offensive, but a series of desperate attempts by the Red Army to rescue its encircled units and a methodical German operation to annihilate them. Zhukov, furious at the turn of events, threw more and more units into the fray, trying to break the encirclement from the outside. But he only succeeded in feeding the meat grinder. The new waves crashed against the same elastic and lethal defense, suffering appalling losses for insignificant terrain. Inside the pockets, the situation was desperate. The Soviet tankers fought to the end. Without fuel, they turned their T-34s into static pillboxes. When they ran out of shells, they fought with their machine guns. And when the ammunition was gone, some even rammed German tanks in suicidal acts of defiance. But it was useless. One by one, they were hunted down and destroyed by Model's Kampfgruppen. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Zhukov personally took command of the 41st Army, but not even his legendary will could change the outcome. The coordination between Soviet infantry, tanks, and artillery had been disastrous, largely due to the bad weather, allowing Model to defeat each component separately. His defense had worked to perfection. He had absorbed the blow, channeled the enemy into his kill zones, and annihilated them with his mobile reserves. By mid-December, the truth was undeniable. Operation Mars had failed catastrophically. Zhukov's main shock forces had been destroyed or surrounded. He had lost over 1,600 tanks and hundreds of thousands of men. On December 20th, Stalin, faced with the scale of the disaster, ordered an end to the offensive. The breaking point had not been German, but Soviet. The Rzhev meat grinder had exacted a terrible price, and the Red Army had suffered one of its worst defeats of the entire war. But in the complex arithmetic of total war, this colossal failure had an unexpected and decisive consequence. While Model's Ninth Army was fighting for its life at Rzhev, it was pinning down some of the best and most powerful divisions in the entire German army. Units like the Grossdeutschland Division, the 1st Panzer Division, and the 9th Panzer Division, all elite formations, were bogged down in the snow and mud of Rzhev. These were precisely the strategic reserves the German High Command desperately needed in the south. They were the only forces that might have had any chance of launching a counteroffensive to break the Stalingrad encirclement and rescue Paulus's Sixth Army. Thus, Model's brilliant defensive victory at Rzhev indirectly contributed to the German catastrophe at Stalingrad. By drawing in and neutralizing Hitler's reserves, Zhukov's failed Operation Mars unintentionally accomplished a crucial strategic objective. It was one of the greatest ironies of the war. Zhukov's most humiliating defeat helped to ensure the Soviet Union's most important victory. Failure in the north enabled triumph in the south. The battle ended in a resounding German defensive victory. The front lines had barely moved, but the Red Army had been bled white. The final figures are chilling. Soviet losses are estimated at around 100,000 killed and 235,000 wounded. Over 1,600 tanks were reduced to smoking scrap. German losses, though severe at around 40,000 men, were significantly lower. It was the greatest defeat in Georgy Zhukov's career. The disaster was of such a magnitude that it was conveniently overshadowed by the glorious victory at Stalingrad and virtually erased from Soviet military historiography for decades. It was a forgotten battle, a mass sacrifice that did not fit the heroic narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Only modern historians like David Glantz have brought to light the true scale and strategic importance of Operation Mars. For the Germans, the defense of Rzhev cemented Walter Model's reputation as a defensive genius, the undisputed master of the crisis. Yet, even in victory, the price was too high. The losses suffered by the Ninth Army were so severe that the position became untenable in the long run. In March of 1943, the Germans executed Operation Büffel, a strategic and perfectly organized withdrawal from the Rzhev salient to shorten the front line and free up divisions for other sectors. The Rzhev meat grinder did not end with a Soviet conquest, but with a calculated German retreat, leaving behind a moonscape of destroyed villages and fields sown with the bones of 500,000 men. A silent monument to one of the bloodiest and most forgotten battles in human history.